Sorry about that delay there, folks. I'd like to welcome you all here to St Pancras Church in Euston in London for tonight's fifth Imperialism on Trial Free Julian Assange event. Tonight you're going to be experiencing something different from the usual Imperialism on Trial events. It's not only going to be just straight speakers, one after another. There'll be 5 speakers. That will then follow into a kind of live crosstalk hosted by a crosstalk host, Mr. Interviewer Extraordinaire, Peter Lavelle. I'm sure many of you'll know, and those that are watching the RT live stream will be familiar with Peter, as they will be familiar with most of the other guests along this wonderful panoply tonight. Right, can I welcome you all for the first speaker of tonight, Mr. Craig Murray. And Craig, if you don't know, was the former UK ambassador to Uzbekistan. He was a whistleblower and a man of conscience and deep conviction. Craig Murray, ladies and gentlemen.
Actually, I want to speak from that one. I think that looks like great fun. It's wonderful to see you all here to support Julian, to see so many of you again. Some of you, I'm quite sure. I left Woolwich Crown Court in a car to get here about 45 minutes ago. Not quite sure. I saw some of you standing outside, and how on earth you got here before me, I have no idea. Plainly, the odd TARDIS was involved, but you've made it, and well done. Those of you who've been there know how horrible and how dispiriting it is. I feel very tired just after a couple of days of attending that court. It's oppressive, it's extremely deliberately unpleasant, it's extraordinarily restrictive. You have a trial that is of interest to the world, and it's deliberately put where the world can't see it. You have a mainstream media that turns up to report it and then doesn't report it. And notably, yesterday, the BBC, The Guardian, ITN, Sky, they were all there yesterday for the prosecution statement. They all left after the prosecution statement. And today was, of course, the opening of the defence, so none of them were there at all, because they have no interest in the defence. All they were interested in doing was putting the government case and using it further to smear Julian. It is deeply dispiriting to be present at this sham of justice and at this much wider demonization in public opinion of Julian, and this failure to present the true facts about the case from those whose job ought to be to present them. And in the court itself, it is impossible to sit in that court without realizing what you are watching is a charade, and that the magistrate has no real interest at all in the arguments, is not giving a fair hearing to the defense. Every single comment the magistrate makes is to query, question, or belittle the points which the defence have made. Her final comments, as we left today, were to point out that although the United States, United Kingdom extradition treaty says you may not be extradited for a political offence, the Extradition Act in UK law does not say you may not be extradited for a political offence. Therefore, irrespective of the content of the treaty, a political offence may still be extraditable. Yesterday, we had the magistrate note that whether or not Julian Assange aided or abetted Chelsea Manning in any way was immaterial, because under the Official Secrets Act, which is the UK equivalent law under the dual criminality rule for extradition, merely to possess official secrets at all, unauthorized possession or unauthorized publication of official secrets are themselves in strict liability illegal. Therefore, the question of whether or not Julian Assange colluded with Chelsea Manning was immaterial. He could be found liable and extradited anyway. And every single comment the magistrate has made has tended to favour the prosecution. There is not even the barest attempt at a covering of impartiality. And there have been times when, the trouble is, you get drawn into the charade. You know, you see, we're going through this process, and you see the defence making some rather good points. Today, we had the defence completely demolish the argument that lives were put at risk by WikiLeaks in the publication of the Afghan war logs and in the publication of the diplomatic cables. That argument was completely demolished. And as well as that, the defence brought out the great good that was done and the terrible things that were revealed in the public interest in terms of extrajudicial killings, murder of children, murder of journalists, torture centres, black ops with death squads going around Afghanistan. And you sat there, and from time to time you think, wow, this is good. Wow, the defence are making good points. Wow, that's a strong argument. And then you realise it doesn't bloody matter, because there isn't a jury anyway. And we're not actually seeing a genuine process. Anyone who doesn't believe the fix is in is very naive. And the prosecution don't appear to be doing terrifically well. Several people keep coming up to me in the courtroom saying, it's going well, isn't it? And the prosecution, you know, they seem underprepared. Well, they are underprepared because they're not particularly trying, because they know that the verdict was decided before they set into the courtroom. They don't have to prepare. What we are witnessing is a show trial, as surely as anything Stalin did was a show trial. And we have to continue to fight this, and we have to continue to push this, and we have to continue to try to change public opinion, to change political opinion, and to convince the British establishment that this is something up with which the British people will not put. It's a long haul. I will be delighted, but absolutely shocked to my core if this magistrate decides against extradition. But I think we will get to appeal, and I think eventually we're going to win in the High Court or the Supreme Court. But that could be 2 or 3 years down the road. And for someone like me who's a friend of Julian and knows him, to see him in his current physical and mental condition is extremely worrying. Today, later in the afternoon, the magistrate actually stopped proceedings for a while to ask whether he was in a fit state of health to continue, because he didn't look in a fit state of health to continue. And today we heard, in court, we heard that yesterday, after the trial, he was twice taken out of his cell and strip searched. But he was 11 times handcuffed. 11 times he had handcuffs put on him and off him yesterday. And that all the papers his lawyers had given him in the court in order for him to be able to participate in his defense, all of the papers were taken off him by the prison. And those included confidential communications, privileged communications, between him and his lawyers on his defense, and the state has simply taken them. These are gross and vile abuses of process, and if there were any real sense of justice here, they would in themselves be enough to stop the proceedings. Just as yesterday we heard how the CIA had arranged spying on him in the Ecuadorian embassy on legal conferences with his lawyers. The American state, which is beginning the extradition, has been spying on the defense. In any genuine process, that by itself would halt proceedings. But what we don't have is any genuine process. Now, I hope you will forgive me, because I'm tired. I'm a little shaken by all of this, shaken by the obvious brutality of it. But the obvious brutality of it is the point. And the purpose of the obvious brutality of it is to shake us and to make us scared and to turn the whole world into compliant citizens. And it is not going to work, because up with this, we will not work. What the Julian Assange case has always been about freedom. It's always been about our right as citizens to know of the crimes which governments commit in our name. It's always been about the right of the people to hold government to account. But it's widened beyond freedom of speech issues. It's turned into a question of the fundamental rule of law and whether there is any access to justice in our society. We are now engaged in a struggle for the heart of our society, in a struggle for whether there is any truth at all in the notion of a liberal democracy, in the notion of liberty, or whether power, untrammeled power, now has no limits, has no possibility of check. Whether the dream that the internet could open up new access, new ways for people to organize, to learn, to disseminate information, whether that dream can be crushed and information is again going to be limited to what's being put out by an increasingly restricted and increasingly lockstepped corporate media. We are engaged in a dreadful struggle, a struggle which is essentially the struggle against fascism. That is where we now stand, and you could not have it more perfectly illustrated than by seeing the goings-on at Woolwich Crown Court. And I am delighted that as we embark on this struggle, we are in such good company with each other. We may be tired, but it is not that we are in bad heart. We are in good heart. We're going to carry on, and we are going to win. Thank you very much indeed.
Right. I just wanted to mention, yes, Neil. I just wanted to mention something about peacemakers in the world, and maybe even politicians that talk peace. We're talking here Tulsi Gabbard, we're talking Saunders, and as soon as these people come up and put their head above the parapet and talk about peace in this world, they're labelled Russian stooges. What a fucking joke. Do you know? You know?
Why are you saying that with me standing?
Imagine equating Russia with peace. Strange concept, that, isn't it? Well, of course it's true. Russia represents peace in this world, and they, the bastards, the imperialist bastards that are framing Julian Assange, aren't fit to kiss the arses of Russians. Thank you. That's my bit.
That's a really nice introduction. Maybe can we do a crosstalk right now? You're all fired up.
So yes, could I just introduce, this is Peter Lavelle. I'm sure you all know Peter Lavelle. Peter Lavelle is bar none the best presenter of a politics show. Thank you, Peter.
You know why? Because we have freedom of speech where I work. We really do, you know. The number of people that have come up to me and say, is that earpiece connected to the Kremlin? And no. You know, people always ask me, well, I always say, you know, the good thing is about my job is that they leave me alone. And the bad thing is that they leave me alone. So I'm always kind of out of the loop, you know. I have no idea what the newsroom is doing. I don't actually watch much television, okay? That tends to blur your vision, unfortunately, most television.
Who cannot tremble with indignation at what happened to Julian Assange just yesterday? Never mind over the last decade. Just yesterday, this man who should be in Oslo getting the Nobel Peace Prize was being stripped and searched by goons, handcuffed, held in 5 different cells in one day, handcuffed 11 times. Handcuffed for what? He was in a bulletproof box all day in the court. What were they searching him up his backside for? Why did they take his legal papers away? Talk about an abuse of process. This is an obscenity in a country that pretends to believe in the rule of law and justice. Who cannot tremble with indignation when we learn that every movement, literally, Craig, every time we went to the toilet in the Ecuadorian embassy, the CIA were watching it on video. I'm not exaggerating. There was a camera in the toilet where Pamela Anderson peed, where Craig Murray and me and others who have the honor to be friends of Julian Assange, but much more importantly than our movements, they spied on every legal meeting that Julian had with his representatives in absolute brazen defiance of the rules of justice and the lawyer-client privilege. As Craig pointed out, in any other, if you were in court because your dog had fouled the pavement, and this kind of abuse of process was unveiled by the defense, the case would be thrown out immediately. No trial can take place when it's been corrupted from the beginning in this way. Who cannot tremble with indignation at the idea that the I'm coming to that point. Who cannot tremble with indignation at the idea that the man that blew the whistle on the war crimes is in Belmarsh and the war criminals are on the BBC and ITV and raking in millions and millions and millions and millions of pounds? The criminals have made it a crime to report on the crimes that they committed. Ponder that. That's now the country that we are living in. Who cannot tremble with indignation? Well, 95% at least of Britain's journalists didn't even show up today to hear the defence's argument. 95% of Britain's broadcasters are not trembling with indignation. if you cannot tremble with indignation at any injustice anywhere, you are not a human being. You have no pulse and you have no soul. And that's the reality of the so-called fourth estate in this country. I spit upon them. This church should be bulging with journalists, because if they had any intention of actually doing their job, what is happening to Julian Assange is a mortal danger to them. It's a knife at their heart. It's a sword of Damocles hanging over their heads if they ever intended to actually be journalists. But of course, the truth is, most of them have sold whatever soul they had just for a ribbon to put on their coat, just for a shilling or two. They have abandoned any claim of moral authority, and these are the people that lecture us, especially at election times. Speaking of which, on the principle that it's better late than never, I'm glad that Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell have finally found a voice to speak up in favour of Julian Assange. And if they'd done so earlier, we might have been further down the road to getting Julian out of Belmarsh.
It's not representing. I mean, when I look at the debates that go on in Parliament, sometimes I don't know what the hell they're talking about. You know, it's like ordinary people. It's completely wrapped up in their whole thing. This whole thing with the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn and all this stuff that they were arguing about. It's just like something completely alien, I think, to normal people and what normal people want. And with this, what's happening with Julian, I think it's of great concern that our country is under threat and that our legal system is under threat from what we've heard from everybody who's been speaking. That's a great concern. And I don't know what's the way out of it, but I think it's a very unhealthy situation. Yeah, politicians are supposed to represent people. They're supposed to represent our interests.
But that's the problem.
Our interests don't seem to be anywhere.
That's the problem, because they've forgotten that they represent us. No, we're supposed to reflect their views, apparently. Okay, that is the crisis of confidence. Neil, jump in.
Yeah, I quite agree. I don't think there's been a time, certainly when, in my lifetime, when the political elite have been so way out of touch, as Mike said, with public opinion. And you put on Parliament, and the only time we show genuine internationalism, genuine concern, is when there's something that can be pinned on the official enemy, when there's something that can be blamed on Russia or the Syrian government. All the MPs turn up and they all say exactly the same thing. Now that George Galloway's not there or Tony Benn's passed on, all say exactly the same thing. Something's got to be done. The new Hitler's doing this, doing that, and that's the only time you get international affairs covered there, really. And the unanimity of the House of Commons is another factor, I think. They're all singing from the same hymn sheet. I think it was Peter that you said this earlier, that Labour, Conservative, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter.
For example, you talk about a bipartisan consensus in the U.S. on foreign policy. I mean, I thought the impeachment of Donald Trump was a joke. He made a call to the Ukrainian president. That's something he shouldn't have done. It was a blunder that the Department of Justice should have dealt with. Biden, who definitely should be investigated.
Quid pro quos never happen.
Right,
okay.
that's the
That
is routine way of foreign policy. I mean, I can go on and list so many examples of that. John Bolton going around and threatening the children of the OPCW director, and also going around the world, if you don't conclude a bilateral treaty with the U.S. on the ICC, we're going to cut off aid. So that's absolutely. But I do think, and you may not agree, that Donald Trump, and he's not the worst president in history, but he has committed war crimes. At least his administration has. For example, saying we're going to steal Syria's oil. That's against the 1905 Hague Convention. That's called pillage. The drone assassinations of Soleimani and innocent civilians. He's also recognizing the colonies in the West Bank of Israel as being legal is a violation of the Geneva Convention. And the fourth one would be he pardoned a war criminal. Actually, put a low-level guy, of course. And he pardoned him. That could be an accessory to war crime after the fact. Why wasn't he impeached for this? Because it's this bipartisan consensus. Right. We cannot discuss this because future presidents want to be able to do that. We don't want to shine light on past presidents. And so they give him a pass on the worst things that he's doing.
You were asking, Peter, why does everyone go along with it? How do they get away with it? I believe that one of the answers to that question is to do with the balance of class forces. The working class in this country and across the Western countries has become disorganized and very leaderless. And the ruling class has become very arrogant, thinks it can do anything, feels it doesn't have to even pretend to its population anymore.
And it makes them sloppy.
Because it's the population that, when it's organized, can hold the ruling class to account. It's not this journalist or that journalist, it's the mass of the people behind the journalists.
But don't you think?
I guess that explains how they can keep pulling the chemical weapons farce in Syria.
But don't you think? Let me go
because they're so brazen, and like you were just saying,
but that's why I said they're so sloppy about it, because they're so arrogant.
They're sloppy because they're arrogant, but in their arrogance, they're teaching workers lessons, and the workers are becoming angry, and they will regret their arrogance. That's for sure.
None of them were written by he himself, and they all had a byline stating this. And yet, 4 years after the fact, the Ukrainian authorities decided that he was suddenly very, very dangerous to the state and he must be imprisoned. So they kept him in pretrial detention, continually delaying and prolonging his detention, never actually giving him a trial. And then his case got even more absurd. I have to just take a look at my notes here. He had, there were 31 volumes of case files. Each volume had between 250 to 400 pages front and back. And he was extremely limited in the time that he could actually see these files in order to know what the supposed evidence and all this stuff that they had collected on him contained. And so I interviewed his lawyer in Kiev, and his lawyer, Andrei Domansky, actually told me that the authorities were starting to come after him in hopes that they could then prevent him from defending Kirill. But anyway, fast forward to the end, he was released in August 2019 in an exchange, although he was never actually tried, he was never actually convicted of anything. But his case, and when I was writing about this, I got in touch with another journalist, Pavel Volkov, and he told me he was subject to the same types of accusations without evidence, and he was held in the same pretrial detention center as Kirill Vyshinsky on charges of, quote, infringing on territorial integrity with a group of people and miscellaneous accessory to terrorism. And then he said that in March 2019 he was acquitted.
And you know, Winston Smith's job was to go back into the archives of the Times and fix what happened 5 years ago. If they said there was going to be that much wheat grown 5 years ago, and in the 5-year plan they didn't do it, he just went back and changed the archives. Well, they're changing it in real time now. They're not going back in the archives. They are deleting the most important information, and again, burying and covering up and apologizing for the worst crimes and ignoring what's going on to the man who's revealed those crimes more than any other journalist.
Thank you for sticking around.